Yeah, my observatory here in Roberts Creek on the Sunshine Coast. I was asked at an executive meeting last month, or a couple of months ago, to talk a little about the process of constructing this as a backyard observatory and as a practical project. So I had all the pictures, figured that it wouldn't be too hard to pull it together. So this is what you're going to see tonight. So the beginnings, I moved to Roberts Creek when my wife and I retired. So back in 2010, I joined the local club, the club that's holding this meeting tonight. Already at that time, my astronomy hobby had evolved to include imaging with a live video camera, a Mallancam, and I was starting to think about using a single lens reflex, a DSLR, for DSO, deep sky object imaging. But for that, using a wobbly tripod wasn't really going to work. You needed to have a fixed permanent pier. And if you've got a fixed pier, that often means putting a building around it and calling it an observatory. Now, as some of you know, the place where I live is part of a small community. It's nestled in the forest, which is a terrible place for building an observatory. But anyway, I decided and I dived in. That's what I built. That's the observatory. Behind is a solid wall of trees that extends all the way down to Elphinstone, for those of you who know the local geography. In front is a cedar stump that's completely overgrown with salal. It wasn't quite that big back in 2010. And in the space available, I built the observatory. Now, if you go out in the territories tonight and you look up at the sky, you get something like that. That's a full view of the sky. That's what I get. So when I say a lousy place to build an observatory, it really is a terrible place.
It's like
the only good thing you can say about that is it's the best bit of the sky. The thing, the objects that come straight overhead, you do at least get a nice clear shot of them. I knew this full well when I had already drawn the map before I built the observatory, and I still went ahead and did it. Crazy me. So planning, I read a lot of books, joined forums online. I learned about the pros and cons of the different designs, domes, roll-off roofs, flip roof, clamshells, all sorts of jargon. How to choose a good site. Guess what? Forests weren't recommended. And all the other things, ventilation, power supply, the load of snow on the roof, that sort of thing. Whether to have a warm room, another one. There are several books that I consulted. The very most recent of those books, I think the most recently published in the whole world, it was actually put together by Charles Ennis, our very own Charles, and published by the RASC. So if you only want to read one book about building a small observatory, then I suggest you try the one from Charles. At the time that I did this, there were quite a few groups, like Yahoo groups, that dealt with small observatories. They all seem to have folded with the demise of Yahoo. Some have popped up elsewhere, but they don't seem to be the same organizations as they were before for building a small observatory. I did find these two useful. This presentation is going to be posted, so you'll be able to get those URLs from the PDF that gets posted on the website. So planning, what scope would I be using? I had an SCT at the time, but I did expect to upgrade that. I wanted to go to DSLR imaging, and definitely a refractor was part of the future. So I had to think about that for future sizing. How big would the space need to be? There wasn't a lot of space available to me, so I couldn't be too generous. Was I going to have shelving, storage? Would there be a computer built in or just a laptop? Would I need internet, Wi-Fi, and so forth? What design? Should I use a warm room? What to build with? In the end, I went with a flip top design. It's very efficient in its use of space. You end up with this box, this cube with a roof that doesn't extend out into any of the adjacent spaces until you open it. So for a space like mine, it really was the only practical design. If I'd put a push-off roof, a roll-off roof design, I would have needed something to roll it onto, and that space wasn't available. Also, it would have been ugly. In the end, it was 7 feet by 8 feet. It had an isolated ground-anchored pier, which is normal for an observatory, so the building is separate from the pier. It just fitted into that available location behind the stump. 8 foot is not a bad size to have as one of your dimensions, because it's very efficient in the way it uses plywood. The frame is just a simple 2x4 frame. You'll see a picture later. Nothing on the walls, no insulation. The roof took a bit more thought, and I ended up with a material called Alu Panel. It had power, it has power, and it's aligned north-south. That was pretty easy to do because that was also coincidentally the alignment of the site. Now, when you're building a flip roof design, the material you use for the roof is pretty important. It's going to have to be pushed off, or somehow you've got to get it off just by pushing it. So it's got to be weatherproof and preferably light. And the material I chose was the one I referred to earlier, Alu Panel. It's used widely by sign makers. I got mine from the local sign maker here in Roberts Creek. It's a sandwich of polyethylene between 2 very thin layers of aluminium, and it's very strong. It comes in 2 forms. One is somewhat flammable, and the other one is fire resistant. I just went with the regular one, not the fire resistant one. If anyone's thinking about building using it, a 3mm sheet, which is what I'm using, 3.8 kilograms per square meter. So each of the roof sections, of the 2 sections, weighs just over 11 kilograms. And then, of course, there's the wooden frame that holds it, and hinged at one side to the walls. And although that's a light structure, it's still heavy when you've got to push it up. And that subsequently proved to be a bit of a problem for me. The design was such that the north overlapped the south when they came down, so kept the rain out, and the whole roof had a slight slope to it that sheds the rain. And it's been running now for more than a decade, and the roof is as good as new. It's never leaked. Some condensation for a while until I put insulation on the roof, but other than that, it's never leaked. And that's it. It's 7 foot by 8 foot box with those 2 Alu Panel roof sections, and yeah, hardly a work of art, but it works very well. These are guy ropes that stop the roof sections from falling all the way over to horizontal. And it turns out that because I had that very limited view, the roof sections don't need to go very far, because with that particular height, I'm able to see all of my sky just with that degree of aperture. It also makes it a lot easier to close the sections, because all you're going to do is pull on those guy ropes and it'll pull the roof back in. In the end, I did put a couple of counterweight fishing weights on ropes attached to the corners of the roof that counterbalance the roof when it gets to the vertical section. That makes it a bit easier to retract at the end of the night. But it wasn't actually necessary to do that. It just made it easier, less strenuous at 3 o'clock in the morning. So how did I build it? Nothing particularly elaborate, no craftsman. It was using 8-inch planks for the structure here, on 6 legs buried on in little inserts in the ground. Here you have an 18-inch deep hole, which is where the concrete is going to get poured for the pier. This is a form sitting around or on top of where the hole is and where the pier is going to go. And that's just so that you get a nice form of the concrete when it's finally set. I put a PVC pipe in the ground because I wanted to be able to get cabling from the middle of roughly the middle of the building out underneath a footpath and over to the warm room if I ever used a warm room. I also put garden cloth down on the grass to kill the vegetation. Here it is shown with the first pour of the concrete, it's still wet, and the rebar has been placed. Next is this device. These are the anchor bolts which the pier will be attached to. It's pretty obvious what they do. I think it's obvious how we're going to use that. So I had the foundry make those for me. There, the anchor bolts have been set into the concrete and the rest of the form has been filled and it's left to cure. So there we have the base. Jumping forward a few steps in the interest of time, that's what the flooring looked like. Now you can see that we have the base for the pier. You can also see how it is separate from the rest of the building. So you can jump up and down on the floor here and it won't have any effect on what's attached to the bolts there. The inside of the building, nothing very fancy. Like I said, I'm not a craftsman. Just 2x4 structure with wiring to the corners where I felt it was needed. The pier, though, is more of a work of art. This was made in a local foundry. So in order to design this, there was lots of material available online about designing piers and lots of theories about whether to pack it with sand or how thick the wall should be and so on. I ended up going with straightforward, simple physics of stiffness of tubes. So the pipe diameter, the wall thickness, and chose values that I felt would give a stable pier, and it proved to be right. It's 9 inches in diameter. I'm not sure what the type of pipe is called, but the wall thickness is actually 1/2 inch. So if it's like wood, it's probably 3/4 inch steel pipe, but the actual thickness is 1/2 inch. It's mounted on an 18-inch base. It's got side fins that reinforce the whole thing, and all the welds continuous. And then, of course, there's a floating plate on top with studs holding it up. Nuts would normally be attached there. And that's where the telescope mount goes and how you adjust it. It was produced to my design at the foundry up on Field Road here in Wilson Creek. And at the time, he hadn't made a pier before, maybe not too surprising. But he did a great job on it. And subsequently, we went back and got a second one made for the club Observatory, which is to essentially exactly the same design. Since then, I know he's made at least one other pier, because when he was selling his business, he was using that pier, the third pier, as part of his advertising what his shop was capable of producing. On top of the pier, this blue aluminium disc. It's a blue puck. And that was a little accessory that I added that gave very smooth connection between the HEQ5 mount that I was using. It bolts to that and moves around on that. So it gives very smooth azimuth adjustment for the equatorial mount. And at the moment, it's not being used. So if anybody would like that, it's available for $30 or best offer. Shouldn't use this to sell my spare parts, should I? So there we are. shortly after it was opened. There's one of our members, James. You'll see this is a more up-to-date picture. The cedar cladding on the side. I also draw attention to the ventilation. I put on the north wall high up, there's a vent, and on the south wall low down, there's a vent. And there's cross ventilation running through the building. And I never had any problem with damp. I did have a small 11-watt heater running underneath the actual telescope cover all the time as part of the condensation control, just to keep the dew point slightly suppressed. And the building is dry as dust. Spiders love it. That was one of the opening days. Here we see it at night. And that's me, master of my domain. And you see the honeysuckle there in bloom. So the second phase was to install the refractor. And that was a set of purchasing decisions, really. And so I'll very quickly go through what they were. I decided to go with a William Optics Megrez, which is a name that they use. This particular one, the 120 millimeter, they no longer produce it. At least last time I looked, they didn't produce it. But I got it, and it was a very, very good scope. So that was the primary instrument. Then I attached to it my flip mirror, the Van Slyke flip mirror. I had this previously with the SCT, and like other flip mirrors, it's just a heavy-duty version made out of a big chunk of aluminium again, and it allows you to have an eyepiece as well as a camera attached, and then you simply, by moving a slider back and forth, you're able to observe, find the object, and then switch the camera into the field of view, and it's all parfocal, so you end up getting an image. So you use your eyepiece to observe, center, and then take a picture. But this one also has a prism that can be inserted into the light path from the side. And so you can take a star in the peripheral view, just on the edge of the field, if there is one. And if there isn't, you can rotate the whole object, the whole device, until you find a star. And then you can use a guide camera in that port. So there's 3 ports, and use that to track. It was fairly pricey. It was a very sophisticated device. And when I stopped using it, I had no trouble selling it to a guy down in the States. They're very much in demand. But I never got it to work. I could never find a star that was suitable to work with in the right place. And if I moved the prism too far in, then it started to appear in the picture that I was trying to take. So it didn't work for me, but it was a great way to still have the camera and to have an eyepiece, so you could do your observing and then flip the mirror and take your pictures. It was perfect for that. The camera was a Canon 60, the Canon D, which was my previously owned camera. I sent it away and had the infrared filter removed to make it more sensitive to hydrogen alpha light. And that process went smoothly, and the camera continues to work in an excellent way. Software for controlling that, taking the pictures, I use Backyard EOS, a Canadian development. At the time, it was only available for Canon, but now it's available for Nikon as well. It's really excellent software. If anyone's thinking about using SLRs, then I definitely suggest you have a look at Backyard EOS. It helps you do all the things that you need to do. There's a guide camera, and the guide camera sits on its own little guide scope. And that's what I actually use for guiding and the mount, making sure that it stays on track. Because the failure of the prism device that I described earlier, I built remote focusing into the system. I took the the fine focus on one side of the focuser, and put a stepper motor on there, and then control that from some software that I wrote that runs on the PC, on the laptop. So I can do fine focusing there, and I can look at the image that I get on the screen, have a look at the histogram for the star that for a star that I'm focusing on, just to test, and just adjust the histogram to the narrowest band, the various statistics that you can calculate that will help you do that to get the sharpest focus. I also use a bottom off mask sometimes as well. And lastly, I built an electroluminescent panel that sits on top as well, because once you start getting serious about taking these images, you need to take darks, which that's easy, but you also need to take flats. So that means you've got to find a way to get a uniform brightness, white or some off-white color, as long as it's uniform, and that's then used as part of the processing process. So I found the simplest way was to just take a piece of electroluminescent material, put it in a picture frame, and then when I need it, I stick it on top of the tube and take a bunch of pictures. So there's the telescope, the Regres 120, the HEQ5 mount that has been extremely reliable. Definitely recommend that. The Canon camera sitting out there on the slider. The guide camera here on its guide telescope. The Van Slyke slider, this gadget here. These are the various knobs that go in and out. Normally you would have an eyepiece in here, and you would have the there, if it had worked, the guide camera would have been in there. The guide camera would have been in there, and the eyepiece would have been in here. This is the remote focuser. There's the stepper motor. This is the gadget for driving it. There's a Telrad sitting up here. Not that I usually need it, because the tracking of the mount and the way that it's been aligned is such that I can normally get very, very close just from the computer control to send it to a star, an object. It's usually very close to the center. And then a big power supply down here that you end up with this sort of equipment. You've got 5 volts, you've got 8 volts, you've got 12 volts. So this is the way that I control all of that, or just provide all of that. There's also a USB hub sitting in there inside the pier that connects all USB cabling together. That's that Van Slyke slider again. This device here is moving the prism in one axis. This is moving the prism in another axis. Here's the eyepiece, here's the camera. That's the electroluminescent panel sitting on top. You can actually do your flats in the daytime. You don't have to do that at night. You're just taking pictures of a white surface. There's the power supply. And there's the control center that controls it all. It's all USB. I use a planning tool called Sky Tools, version 3. There's now a version 4, which I don't have, and Backyard EOS for controlling the camera. Any questions?
Nice image there.
I just came across that this week. It's taken by Adam Block. I didn't realize there was a nebula called the question mark. So does anybody have any visions of building their own observatory?
Maybe one day.
Who was that?
Ed, I was thinking it might be nice to build something at my place, maybe, but we'll see. It's nice to have something permanent that you just go to and it's always set up, because moving a tripod out, setting things up someplace, you know, by the time you got everything aligned, you don't have a lot of time left, and it's tiring. Setup is tiring. So having everything ready to go is a great thing.
Absolutely. And in the case of this sort of astronomy as well, you take long runs. Maybe the camera's running for hours taking the pictures. And as long as you trust the equipment, you can actually walk away and go outside and look at the stars outside of the observatory while the equipment is going off and doing all its work. So you can even pop inside and watch an episode from Netflix and pop out again. And that's my Netflix astronomy.
The most common reason people gave for building observatories when I was researching that observatory book was, I'm tired of putting it up and taking it down again. But yeah, you know, the advantage of having a brief period that you can view the sky because of the weather and being able to jump in there and get it rather than be frustrated by setting up the telescope just to have that piece of sky disappear on you. That was the most common reason given.
Well, I would certainly concur with that.
Did you notice the rolling out the heavy telescope videos got over 450 views now? So I guess a lot of people are thinking about that.
Yes, for those of you who are new to our meetings tonight, go to our YouTube channel. Danny, a little while ago, did a presentation which we put on the YouTube channel of how he set up his telescope to roll out of the shed. It's worth looking at.
I finished by putting in a few images that I took. I think these are all actually on the club website, but there's Dumbbell,
Nice.
that was Horsehead, the Crescent. This one got an award from the club competition for best image of the year. Orion, 82, M82.
Wow.
The moon. I've also got one of the wall, but I couldn't find that when I was putting this presentation together. Jupiter. That's it. Thank you.